So, I am now the chairman of this next session, and I have the pleasure to announce the conference by Miltiades Katsopoulos about recent research in the ancient Macedonian dialect, consolidation, and new perspectives. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Modern discussion in the speech of the ancient Macedonians began in 1808, when Sturz published in Leipzig a small book entitled the Dialectum Macedonica Liber, intended to be a scientific inquiry into the position of Macedonian within Greek. However, after the publication of Müller's work über die Wohnsitz, die Abstammung und die ältere Geschichte des makedonischen Volks, Berlin 1825, the discussion evolved into an acrimonious controversy, initially scientific but soon political, about the Greek or non-Greek nature of this tongue. Diverse theories were put forward. A. Macedonian is a mixed language, either of partly Illyrian origin, such was, for instance, the position of Müller himself, of Katsarov, Rostovtsev, Budimir, or of partly Thracian origin, as it was maintained by Zenov. B. Macedonian is a separate Indo-European language. This was, for example, the opinion of Pisani, Rousseau, Chantraine, Pudic, Bock, Schwitzer, Georgiev, Tarn, and Olivier Masson in his youth. C. But according to most scholars, Macedonian was a Greek dialect. This view has been expanded, among others, by Sturz himself, Abel, Fick, Hadzidakis, Hoffman, Solmsen, Lesny, Geyer, Hammond, Kaleris, Toynbee, Edson, Pogerts, Katic, Sakellariou, Babiniotis, and Olivier Masson in his mature years. D. Finally, a small number of scholars thought that the evidence available was not sufficient to form an opinion. Such was the view of Antoine Meillet and Arnaldo Momigliano. Whatever the scientific merits of the above scholars, it was the nature of the evidence itself, and above all its scarcity, which allowed the propounding of opinions so diverse and incompatible between themselves. In fact, not one phrase of Macedonian, not one complete syntagm had come down to us in the literary tradition, because Macedonian, like many other Greek dialects, was never promoted to the dignity of a literary vehicle, because the Temenid kings, when they endowed their administration with a chancery worthy of the name, adopted the Attic koine, which in the middle of the 4th century was prevailing as the common administrative idiom around the shores of the Aegean basin. Thus, the only available source for knowledge of Macedonian speech were the glosses, that is to say, isolated words collected by lexicographers, mainly from literary works because of their rarity or strangeness, and also personal names, which, as we know, are formed from appellatives. For instance, Nikephoros from Nike and the stem of Pharaoh. The glosses, rare and strange words by definition, had the major defect of being liable to corruption, to alterations in the course of transmission through the ages by copyists who could not recognize them. As far as personal names are concerned, for want of reliable epigraphic corpora of the Macedonian regions, until very recently it was impossible to compile trustworthy lists. On top of that, these two sources of information, far from leading to convergent conclusions, suggested conflicting orientations. The glosses, you may see that under number 1, the glosses, on the one hand, included, besides words with a more or less clear Greek etymology, for instance, Karpaia orchesis Macedoniki, confer Karpos, Kynupes arktoi Macedones, confer Kynops, Ramata Botridia staphylis Macedones, confer Rax, genitive Ragos. Also, they included a significant number of terms hard to interpret as Greek. This is under 1b. Exempli gratia, Goda, Entera, Macedones, Gotan, Hyn Macedones, Skoidos, Archetis Paramacedosi. On the other hand, the vast majority of personal names not only were perfectly Greek, you can see that under 2a, Philippos, Alexandros, Parmenion, Antipatros, Antiochos, Arsinoe, Eurydice, but also presented original traits excluding the possibility of their being borrowed from the Attic dialect, which was the official idiom of the kingdom from the middle of the 4th century BC. So these traits, you can see them in 2b, such as the retention of the long A in Amintas, Machatas, Alketas, Lagos, or indeed from many other Greek dialects, such as the practical not attested elsewhere, Ptolemaios, Kratevas, Bouplagos. These names do not occur elsewhere, so they cannot have been borrowed from another Greek dialect. Until very recently, it was hard to tell which set of evidence was more trustworthy. During the last 30 years, the situation has radically changed thanks to the publication of the epigraphic corpora of Thessaloniki in 1972 and Northern Macedonia in 1999 by the Berlin Academy, and of Upper Macedonia in 1985, and Beroe as the first part of the inscriptions of the Third Maurice, by the Research Center for Greek and Roman Antiquity, Kera. Meanwhile, the latter center has also published 4 important onomastic collections of Beroe, of Edessa, of Macedonians attested outside their homeland, and of central Mygdonia, the cities Anthemus and Kalindoia. Finally, in 2005, appeared the 4th volume of the monumental series Lexicon of Greek personal names, containing the anthroponyms of Macedonia. This intense epigraphic activity, fed by continuous archaeological discoveries, has brought to light an abundance of documents, among which the first texts written in Macedonian. This new body of evidence rendered to a large extent irrelevant the old controversies and required an ab initio reopening of the discussion on a different basis. Old theories, however, die hard, and relics of obsolete erudition still encumber handbooks and scientific journals. I particularly have in mind Crossland's chapter in the 2nd edition of Volume 3.1 of the Cambridge Ancient History, which appeared in 1982, Borza's latest booklet, published in 1999, and then in his history, published in 2005, History of the Greek Language, Adrados still withholds his judgment, awaiting for the discovery of additional evidence. While as late as 2009, Silk ignores the Pella tablet and all the lively discussion it has given rise to, and prefers to leave open the issue of the nature of ancient Macedonia. One reason, perhaps the main one, for such resistance to the assimilation of new information and for the persistence of obsolete theories until these very last years is the way in which, since the 19th century, the scholarly discussion about Macedonian speech and its Greek or non-Greek character has focused on the sporadic presence in Macedonian glosses and proper names, which otherwise looked perfectly Greek, of the sign of the voiced stop, beta, delta, gamma, instead of the corresponding unvoiced, originally aspirated stop, expected in Greek, as for instance in Valakros, Berenika, instead of Phalakros, Perenika. Here I must open a parenthesis. You can see that under 3. The occlusive consonants of Greek are the heirs of an Indo-European system which differed from the Greek one in that it possessed an additional series of occlusive consonants pronounced with both the lips and the velum. This series survived until the Mycenaean period, but was subsequently eliminated from all Greek dialects in various ways. Moreover, in the Indo-European system of consonants, the place of the Greek series of unvoiced aspirate stops was occupied by a series of voiced aspirate stops, that is to say, voiced stops accompanied by a breathing. These last ones, bh, dh, gh, gh, survived to a large extent only in Sanskrit and in modern Indian dialects. Elsewhere, they either lost their breathing, such is the case of the Slavonic, Germanic, Celtic, and Celtic languages, or their sonority, such is the case of the Greek and Italic languages, in which they evolved into p, t, k, qu. Thus, the root bear, you can see that under 4, is represented by the verb parami in Sanskrit, bero in Old Slavonic, bera in Gothic, berem in Ancient Irish, phero in Greek, and phero in Latin. The supporters of the non-Greek nature of Macedonian reasoned as follows. If, instead of the well-known Greek personal names Phalakros, the bold one, or Pherenike, she who brings victory with a P, we read the name Valakros or Berenika with a beta on the inscriptions of Macedonia. This is because the Macedonian tongue has not participated in the same consonant mutations as prehistoric Greek already before the first Mycenaean documents in Linear B, which had transformed the aspirate voice stops of Indo-European bh, t, gh into aspirate unvoiced stops p, t, k. That is to say that instead of the loss of sonority of Greek, we are dealing with the loss of aspiration Macedonian, which classifies the latter along the Slavonic, the Germanic, and the Celtic languages. But if Macedonian was separated from Greek before the second millennium BC, it cannot be considered a Greek dialect, even an aberrant one. What the partisans of such theories have not always explicitly stated is that they all rely on the postulate that the sounds rendered by the signs beta, delta, gamma in Macedonian, glosses and proper names, are the direct heirs of the series of voiced aspirate stops of Indo-European and do not result from a secondary sonorization within Greek of the series represented by the signs phi, theta, chi. However, one must be wary of shortcuts and simplifications in linguistics. For instance, the sound t in the German word Mutter is not the direct heir of the same sound in the Indo-European word mater, but has evolved from the common Germanic form mother, mother in Old Saxon, which was the reflex of Indo-European mater. The example of Latin demonstrates that the evolution b, p, f, v, and b envisaged above is perfectly possible. We can look at that under 5. Thus, the form albus, white, in Latin, does not come directly from Indo-European alphos. In fact, the stem alp became first alp, then alf in italic, and it was only secondarily that the resulting spirant sonorized into alv, which evolved into alb in Latin. Confer, alfu in Umbrian equal albos in Latin, accusative plural, and we have alphus in Greek. George Hatzidakis was the first and for many years the only one to stress the importance, at the same time the weakness of the implicit postulate of the partisans of the non-Greek character of Macedonian, to wit, the alleged direct descent of the series represented by the signs of the voice stops in the Macedonian glosses and personal names from the Indo-European series of aspirate voice stops. Since the middle of the 80s of the last century, the acceleration of archaeological research in Macedonia and also the activities of the Macedonian program of the Research Center for Greek and Roman Antiquity, KERA, mentioned above, occasioned numerous scholarly works exploiting the new evidence that had been collected and allowed us to go beyond the Gordian knot, which since the 19th century had kept captive all discussion about the tongue of the ancient Macedonians. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the obstacle hindering the identification of the language spoken by Philip and Alexander was removed. Ancient Macedonian, as we shall see, was really and truly a Greek dialect. On this point, almost all linguists or philologists actively dealing with the problem are of the same opinion. It is equally true that they do not agree on everything. Two issues still raise serious contention. A, how should be explained this sporadic presence in Macedonian glosses and proper names of the signs of the voice stops beta, delta, gamma, instead of the corresponding originally aspirate unvoiced ones, phi, theta, chi, of the other Greek dialects? B. What is the dialectal position of Macedonian within Greek? The first issue was tackled several times in recent years, but with divergent conclusions by Claude Brix, Anna Panayotou, Olivier Masson, Laurent Dubois, and the present speaker. On the issue of the dialectal affinities of Macedonian within Greek, besides the above-mentioned scholars, Nicholas Hammond and Emmanuel Boutiras also made significant contributions. As far as I was concerned, I was gradually convinced that the two issues were intimately linked, or rather, that a search for the affinities of the Macedonian dialect could provide a satisfactory explanation of this controversial particularity of its consonantal system, and I presented my conclusions in my communication to the 4th International Congress of Greek Dialectology, held in Berlin in 2001. In the intervening 11 years, no new decisive piece of evidence, primary evidence, has come to light. Two minor and two major publications, which have appeared since then, one of them intimately connected with our workshop, prompt me, however, to revisit these two issues regarding the speech of the ancient Macedonians. First, the Greek character of ancient Macedonian and the origin of the sporadic presence of voiced instead of unvoiced stops. 1a, the Indian mirage. By an extraordinary coincidence, two papers by an Australian and two Italian scholars, published in the same year, 2006, resurrected Paul Kretschmer's old theory according to which ancient Macedonian had retained the Indo-European voiced aspirates. O'Neill's article on the Doric forms in Macedonian inscriptions can be readily disposed of. It is poorly documented. Its author is totally ignorant of the important contributions by Olivier Masson, Claude Brix, Anna Panayotou, Argyro Tataki, and the present speaker in the field of Macedonian linguistics and onomastics, and he commits serious factual mistakes. I give such just an example. He considers the proper name Apelas, Artemas, Asklepas, Damas, Hermas, Zosas, Primigas, Arapas, and the same as Doric, and lumps them together with Amintas, Elanika, Lika, etc. Incomplete documentation and factual errors, combined with assertions betraying a serious misunderstanding of the evolution of the Greek language, such as dating the development of the voice stops to voice fricatives in the 4th century AD, and with uncritical acceptance of ancient literary sources, such as Philotas's speech in Curtius Rufus, fatally led to the unrealistic theory that the ancient Macedonian speech had retained the original Indo-European voiced aspirate stops. Negri and Rocca, the two Italians, put forward the same theory in a more sophisticated form in their communication to the 6th International Encounter of Greek Linguistics held at Bergamo in 2005, which was not exempt of political overtones. They contended that the change of Indo-European voice stops into unvoiced ones was essentially a Southern Greek phenomenon which became less and less operative as one moved northwards. Thus, Macedonian would have initially retained its series of voice stops, which may have lost their breathing later under Illyrian influence. The reconstruction of the evolution of Macedonian consonantism is purely theoretical and is based on second-hand information which is not always free of error. Under such conditions, their ambition to eliminate Kretschmer's vielleicht, he says perhaps in his theory of the retention of the voiced aspirates, could hardly be attained. The hypothesis of the retention of the voiced aspirates by Macedonian alone among Indo-European languages of Europe and the Near East is, to say the least, hazardous. Moreover, it does not take into consideration the voicing of simple unvoiced stops, which is amply documented and to which I have repeatedly drawn attention. Finally, a form such as genestai with a toe in the pellet tablet, it's on the other side of the handout, the 8th line, kai Macarian genestai, with a to, suffices to decisively belie such a fanciful theory. For if it were true, it should have been spelled genestai, with a theta, or genestai, or genesai, with a delta or a z, but never genestai, which is the reflex of an earlier genestai, with a theta representing a fricative genestai, a fricative unvoiced dental consonant. From the interference hypothesis to the Greek hypothesis. The two chapters contributed to the sumptuous volume of Αρχαία Macedonia by two distinguished Spanish linguists are of a quite different class. Emilio Crespo's masterly overview of the languages and dialects in ancient Macedon and his detailed examination of the non-Greek borrowing, fricativization, interference hypothesis, as well as Julian Mendes Dousuna's both thorough and fully documented investigation of Macedonian consonantism and vocalism, and his definitive presentation of ancient Macedonian as a Greek dialect, constitute major contributions to the linguistic history of northern Greece. However, it was a risky endeavor because it required not only expertise in linguistics, but also a holistic approach to ancient Macedonia, based on familiarity with its geography, history, and material culture. Its great merit is that it offers an amply documented and authoritative confirmation of what should have become evident in the course of the last 3 decades, that recent discoveries and investigations, to use Emilio Crespo's own words, settled the bitter question of the ancient Macedonian language almost in a definitive manner. The above broad consensus does not necessarily mean that all questions are definitely answered or that I agree on all my issues with my Spanish colleagues, who besides, quite naturally, are not always in agreement among themselves. This paper was prepared before I heard Emilio's presentation here, so I apologize for things that are no longer relevant, perhaps. For instance, I would not agree that the spellings dialexaimi and anoroxasa instead of dialixaimi and anoruxasa on line 3 of the Pella curse tablet, or the various forms of the 3rd month of the Macedonian calendar, Audonaios, Audunaios, Audunaios, denote an opening of I and U. On the contrary, in my opinion, there are inverted spellings attesting the closure of I and O to I and U. I would meticulously distinguish between the use of voiced plosives and the use of the sign of the voiced plosive. I would not invoke the out-of-date assertion by Michel Lejeune, who was my teacher, that in Greek the change of stops to fricatives took place in the 1st century BC in order to argue against the early fricativization of plosives in Macedonia, since spellings such as genestai with the to and bephaios instead of bebaios attested in Amphipolis prove that in Macedonia this stage had been reached by the 4th century BC at the latest. In view of Plutarch's information that the Delphians voiced the sound P in the beginning of words, I would not affirm that plosives in the beginning of a word are stable throughout the history of Greece. Indeed, in Macedonia itself, we encountered the voiced form Gyudias with a gamma, along with the Pan-Hellenic one of that name, which is Kydias with a kappa, as well as the forms of Mount Boion instead of Mount Poion, and Gorpiaios instead of Carpiaios, which is the Macedonian name taking its name from Karpos, corresponding to the month of August. I certainly never stated that, I quote, the shift of the voiced and voiceless plosives into fricatives is not due to any lexical or phonetic interference from some other language, unquote. On the contrary, I have repeatedly ascribed it to the influence of a foreign substratum or adstratum, be it Pelasgian or Phrygian or Thracian or whatever. It is not true that, with the exception of Berenica, spelling with beta, delta, or gamma, do not appear in personal names for individuals of higher status. The prosopographic study of persons bearing names such as Valakros instead of Palakros, Stadmeas instead of Stathmeas, or Gaiteas instead of Haiteas, amply prove the opposite. More significantly, I consider unfounded a series of conclusions which are supposedly based or strengthened by the above assertions: that the Macedonian kings spoke Greek and reigned over non-Greeks, that the Macedonian was unintelligible, that Macedonians were bilingual until the subjection of their country to the Romans. This is a case where a pure linguistic approach of a problem may lead to inaccurate conclusions. The first assertion is apparently based on Isocrates, but the Athenian orator nowhere says that the Macedonians did not speak Greek. He says that Macedonia is outside Greece, that they are not homophiloi, and so on. The distinction he draws between Macedonians and Greeks is of an entirely different nature, and it has to do with the politics of that period. Philotas' speech by Curtius Rufus, on which the second assertion is based, cannot be used without taking into consideration the various commentaries it has given rise to. In fact, what Philotas says is that non-Macedonians would understand him more easily, Facilius, if he used the Attic Koine, which would not make sense if he had in mind an entirely different language, such as Phrygian or Thracian. Finally, Strabo's remark on bilingual population does not refer to Macedonia proper, but to populations living in the marches between Epirus and Illyria, which had been included in the Roman province of Macedonia and spoke both Greek and Illyrian, as is attested by the epigraphic material of that region. Conversely, I am not at all convinced by my friend Julian Mendes Dosuna's contention that the Alexaimi, Ime, and Anoroxasa on lines 3 and 6 of the Pelakers tablet, instead of the Elixaimi, Eimi, and Anoryxasa, are plain slips with no phonetic significance, for they are confirmed by another 4th century BC inscription from Pella, on which we read Este instead of Esti, and Iphicratis instead of Iphicratis, and by similar occurrences in Thessaly. However, these objections concerning a few details should not detract from the attainments of the monumental volume of the Center of the Greek language. I consider that has established beyond doubt, as Julian Mendes Dosuna so aptly states, that, I quote, the glosses recorded by Ezechius and the few documents possibly written in the local idiom indicate that Macedonian was a Greek dialect. 2. The dialectal position of Macedonia. A neglected contribution, un autre modèle de développement. The conclusion of my communication to the Fourth International Congress of Greek Dialectology consisted in an historical interpretation of the Macedonian linguistic particularities. Pursuing a hypothesis by Nicholas Hammond, I suggested that the Macedonian dialect of the 4th century that we read on the Pella tablet was a sort of Macedonian koine or koina, resulting from the encounter of the idiom of the Aeolic-speaking transhuman shepherds gravitating around Mount Olympus in the Pierian Mountains, with the Argead Macedonians hailing from Argos Orestikon, from the Pindus region. These were the speakers of a northwestern dialect who founded the Kingdom of Lower Macedonia, incorporating into it the so-called Aeolic-speaking earlier inhabitants, whose phonetics had been influenced by a non-Greek, Phrygian or Pelasgian adstratum. The most notable particularity of their speech was the tendency to pronounce as voiced the old set of unvoiced aspirates, which had become fricatives already at an early stage, but also non-aspirate stops under certain conditions. This particularity is especially attested in the southeastern part of Macedonia and in northern Arabia. When I wrote this text for my communication to the Greek Dialectology Congress, I was not aware that Bruno Elie will be presenting to the same Congress a major contribution on the dialects of northern Greece, which, in my opinion, was going to revolutionize our conception of their development. In particular, Elie expanded and improved my suggestion about the Aeolic-speaking inhabitants, which was limited to the Olympus and Pieria region in my paper. He presented the well-argued and documented hypothesis of a North Achaean substratum extending as far north as the head of the Thermaic Gulf, where it was in contact with Thracians and other non-Greek populations. In prehistoric times, both in Thessaly and Macedonia to be, this Achaean substratum had a sustained relation with northwest Greek-speaking population groups living on the other side of the Pindus mountain. Occasional contacts evolved into cohabitation following the population movements of the 7th century BC, when the Thessaloi wandered from Thesprotia to western Thessaly, that is to say, to the region that would become the Thessaliotis, one of the four tetrades of Thessaly proper. During the same century, the Argead Macedonians completed their parallel wandering from Orestis to Lower Macedonia, expelling the Phrygians from the foothills of the Bermian and the Pierian mountains, which would become the cradle of their power. The Thessalian and Macedonian dialects of the historical period, which are attested in inscriptions, are a sort of koina resulting from the interaction and reciprocal influences of various elements, the most important of which are the North Achaean substratum, the northwestern idioms of the Thessaloi, and the Argead Macedonians and the Thracian and Phrygian adstrata. Conclusion. I could not conclude this overview without paying tribute to an unfortunately still unpublished recent paper by a pioneer of the study of ancient Macedonian, Claude Brix, to whom I am attached by 25 years of scholarly disputes and affectionate friendship. In December 2007, he kindly sent me a manuscript of his contribution to a collective volume on comparative Indo-European linguistics entitled Le Dialecte grec de Macédoine, due to be published by de Gruyter. It is a short but comprehensive synthesis presenting the status quaestionis and his own revised views, which could be summarized as follows. A. It is likely that the conquering Argead Macedonians who spoke a northwestern dialect, when they came down from Mount Pindus, met in the plains Achaean Greeks mixed with non-Greek populations. B. The substitution of the sign of the voiceless aspirate stop by that of the voice stop cannot be explained by a survival of the Indo-European aspirate voice stop or its non-aspirate reflex. C. The present speaker's position concerning the tendency in the Macedonian dialect under certain conditions, A, of all voiceless stops towards sonorization, and B, of aspirates and voice stops towards spirantization, ought to be taken seriously into consideration for the first is a regional or an areal phenomenon going back to the 6th century, and the second, a more general phenomenon in Greek attested at least from the 5th century BC. D, given Macedonia's geographical position, the sporadic penetration of Thracian and Phrygian personal names and terms responsible, among other things, of hybrid forms such as Vilistichi and Philomaga, should not be excluded. The global effect of the scholarly contributions previously examined is both a consolidation and a sharpening of knowledge attained by earlier works. To the confirmation of the Greek character of the ancient Macedonian idiom, especially by Emilio Crespo, Julian Mendes Dosuna's contribution added his penetrating understanding of the voicing process, strengthening thus the validity of the so-called Greek hypothesis as an adequate tool for the interpretation of the sporadic use of the sign of the originally voiced stops in place of the corresponding originally voiceless aspirates. Additionally, Bruno Elie's innovative contribution embraced the linguistic prehistory of the whole northern Greece and offered a comprehensive answer to a series of contentious questions regarding the formation of its dialects, which had for generations bedeviled the work of both linguists and historians devoted to the study of this area in antiquity. Finally, Claude Brix's synthesis will soon make available an authoritative overview of the Greek Macedonian dialect. I thank you for their patience, and I thank, of course, the organizers of this workshop who had the kindness to invite me and to give me the opportunity to speak before such a distinguished audience. Thank you.
Thanks a lot of this presentation. Are there comments, remarks, and others? Emilio.
Sorry, I have to start by asking your comprehension, because I'm not sure I understood what you mean about the Alexei, that you...
I think that there are inverted spellings.
Yes.
And it's not an original thought. It has been first proposed by Briggs in his paper from the fourth Congress in Naples, from Naples.
Ischia.
Big one. But when you wrote the common article, was the... Which one? We have written two common articles. In at the time of Verbum, the curse tablet was not known. Perhaps, yes.
No. Thank you. Yeah. I have to tell that I'm agree with the whole presentation you have made, and I have to tell that 1 year ago my impression was that there were no mean in avoiding to think that there was an stratum being living at the time of the, let's say, Alexander the Great in this time. But and that was the main reason for the presence of these frigatives and these voiced plosives. But as time goes by, I'm changing my mind, thinking that for one part we don't know sufficient evidence to make us to have a based conclusion, and on the other side, the parallels in other languages have also many problems to explain themselves and to be of much help to explain our problems. So that we have, unfortunately, we have not any basis, any solid basis to build a new theory.
I'm a little more optimistic than you are. I think that we're reaching a consensus, more or less. I mean, take into consideration your Palinodea, to a certain extent. Briggs's last article, the one which will be published next year, I hope. And we say more or less the same thing now. And of course, Julian tells the same story. So I think that there is hope that we will reach, well, there will always be some latitude for doubts and questioning, I mean, but our views will be much less divergent than they were.
With the evidence we have at our disposal, now, yes. There is a great consensus, I would say.
Yeah, please.
Okay. I'm not a linguist, so I will ask a non-linguistic question.
Are we absolutely certain that the tablet of Pella is written in Macedonian dialect? I believe that this is the most probable hypothesis, but it is not the only one. So there is some margin for doubt, even in that respect. So my question is, to what extent can we, on grounds of further evidence, be certain that this is a pure example of Macedonian? Because we don't know, we have no information on the provenance of the woman who wrote this down.
The reason or the arguments in favor of it being Macedonian was given this morning by Emilio Crespo. First, it's no other known Greek dialect. The traits, the phenomena that we observe on this tablet are nowhere else encountered altogether. This is one good reason. And the other good reason is that some of the phenomena are known to be Macedonian from elsewhere, just like the sounding of the stops. Well, you have from the start, from the beginning, you have been dubitative about it. But I think as time goes by, there is less and less reason to be.
I think there's room for reasonable doubt still. It is not a large doubt, but there is some room for doubt on not on linguistic, not for linguistic reasons, but taking into consideration especially the social and the historical context.
In that field, Emilio Crespo gave an answer this morning saying...
I was not present.
You were not present. That in all cases that we know, curse tablets are in the language of the
This is an argument I used myself.
Yeah.
This is an argument I used myself, but I think that it is less forceful for Pella than it is for other areas of the Greek world. This is not to say that I do not agree with these conclusions, just that we should keep in mind that there is some small room for doubt still.
Anna would like to...
I think that the next communication will be on the common features of Pella with other inscriptions and how Pella fits in the pattern. So I think that the most prominent feature is the other defixio from Arethusa. Although it's very fragmentary, I think that it fits. But not only that, all or most of early 4th century, 5th century, and early 4th century inscriptions can have the same, are pieces of the same picture.
Thanks a lot. We will have the next speaker, Anna Panayotou from Cyprus. and she will continue this discussion, a critical survey of the question of ancient Macedonian. Please.
I think, yes.
You would like to be here?
Yes, because I have a PowerPoint to present. And
That's right. No, yeah, that's better. That's it. Yeah, fine. Installing here, click here, go here. That's it. Yeah, that.
okay. Τώρα μισό λεπτό.
Do you need?
Yes.
Yeah. And another one? What's your? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We make it
Yes.
great, yeah?
Yes, yes.
Here. Slideshow. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I don't think a second one. It's. First of all, I would like to thank for the invitation and to congratulate the organizing committee, Professors Emilio Crespo, George Yanakis, Antonios Arengakos, and their team of the friendly workshop which brought us together trying to examine with a more critical view ancient Greek dialectology and evaluate the new perspectives which have emerged in more recent times. In this communication, I attempted a survey of the established facts on ancient Macedonian, but also of the latest state of play in the scholarly research. In a necessarily brief account and before such an audience, I shall give just an overview of points on Macedonian that are, or I think that they are, beyond doubt, on phonology, morphology, syntax, and lexicon of Macedonian. There will be also a section on archaic, classical, and early Hellenistic personal names, classified from semantic point of view, with special attention to their contribution to the knowledge of the Macedonian lexicon and semantics. I shall insist, however, on others which are discussed over and over again, sometimes because of lack of necessary information and investigation. Finally, my communication will review some recent contribution on ancient Macedonia and the place they reserved for the language issue. According to the epigraphical material available nowadays, the dialect did not survive in writing after the beginning of the 3rd century BC. I mean that the last dialectal judicial defixio from Arethusa, you mean here, and you have the problems we have just mentioned. My goodness. Oh, it's okay. So this is the last, in my view, written attempt to present Macedonian in writing. This Macedonian died out as a spoken medium before the end of the first millennium BC. The last mention of the use of Macedonian refers to Cleopatra VII in Egypt, and it is dated to the 1st century BC. Strabo's passage, being dated in the early Roman period, says that Macedonians and Acarnanians use the same language. It goes without saying that proper names of all kinds, and more rarely other forms, survived sporadically in texts written in Koine without affecting its syntax or morphology. A prerequisite for any study on Macedonia, Macedonians, and Macedonian is to make as clear as possible a definition of the territory and the speakers of Macedonian. Thus, the territory defined as Macedonia conventionally covers at the end of the reign of Philip, at 336, the area east of Mount Pindus, west of the river Nestos, and north of Heraklion in Pieria. It therefore comprises Orestis, Linkos, and part of Amphaxitis, Mygdonia, Crestonia, and Bisaltia as far as the river Strymon. Specifically, by 336, the kingdom of the Temenids had gradually annexed to its territory areas inhabited by the Macedonian tribes of the upper regions, Ethni Epanothen, as Thukydides states, while Anthemus and other regions east of Axios, chiefly parts of Mygdonia, as far as Euporia near river Strymon, were already under Macedonian control, at least by the end of the 6th century BC. This development, of course, was not always straightforward. Nomadic life, social structures, and the progressive expansion of the Macedonians in the Archaic and Classical periods did not particularly favor the development of writing until the consolidation of the Argead kingdom, according to the sources, especially during the reign of Archelaus. According to the available data, based on the combination of information supplied by ancient sources with archaeological evidence, the inscriptions of the 6th and 5th centuries BC from Macedonia within the boundaries defined above come from the areas where urban development was manifested through archaeological excavations and finds, and B, the presence of Macedonians can be reasonably argued from historical point of view. Whether in major cities like Pella or Aigai, or in smaller like Eani, the close relation between urban development and the dissemination of writing is, I think, established. This link gives an important dimension of the Macedonian language and culture. It must be stressed that almost all the sites where early inscriptions have been discovered were controlled at that time by Macedonians. Moreover, these sites, especially Eani, the capital of Elymia, of Aigai, the capital of the kingdom of Argeads before Pella, the Archondikon in Botier, the actual Syndos, Halastra, and Thermi or Agia Paraskevi in Anthemos present a remarkable cultural unity through archaeological finds. These common cultural features lead to the conclusion, in my opinion, that all these findings belong or refer to Macedonia. So, from these sites, you have texts which are dated before the mid-4th century. From the middle 4th century BC on, writing was spread to almost all the areas of the Macedonian kingdom, but moves rapidly in the developed and prosperous centers of Lower Macedonia. Let's pass to the use of the Macedonian dialect. The expressions Makedonizin and Makedonigion Tephoni are used for Macedonians during the campaigns of Alexander until the end of the 4th century BC. In the end of the century, Macedonian is used orally only for communication within the community, mainly in moments of anger or tender emotions. The Patrius Sermo, used by Curtius, referring back to Alexander, was not understood by all people present. His phrasing is a pluribus. Macedonian was forgotten even in Ptolemaic court, to Makedonizin eklipondon, Cleopatra VII being a brilliant exception according to Plutarch. In this passage, as in other ancient sources, glossa and dialectos are synonymous, which means language form. The same indications we have from Seneca the Younger. Macedonicus Sermo, as you see, means that we have an information which reflects the Macedonian forced installation of some ethnic. Here again, sermo is used as the term lingua, and in Greek, glossa and dialectos, with the meaning of speech. The comparison of passages of some grammarians and articists proves beyond any doubt that during the Roman period, Makedonizin and Makedonikos means aius koine, non-Attic, vulgar, Paula, Greek. It is obvious the same expression of koine are qualified as Macedonian by some writers, by others as Xenikes, or expressions of ignorant, uncultivated people, amathon, or younger, neoteron. It is obvious that koine was associated with the people who spread it, the popular expressions and words being gradually associated with or attributed to Macedonians, and the dinos Makedonica words had to be corrected. According to Pollux, irite men alefteles. It is common use, but it is vulgar. Concerning phonology, as I promised in the beginning, I shall refrain myself from discussing today the major issue raised in antiquity, first by Plutarch, concerning the use of beta antitu phi. I shall only emphasize again some issues rather epigrammatically concerning this issue. As it is obvious, I think, the feature, whatever it is, affects not only or not mainly words etymologically associated with Indo-European aspirates, as Paul Kretschmer taught in the 19th century. Ancient grammarians and modern specialists add examples from various sources, making the Kretschmer's argumentation invalid. Second, it is true that most of the older examples we can localize come from inscriptions from Aigai. It is possible, therefore, that the phenomenon spread from the old capital to all over Macedonia. With due respect, the dialectal lavdefixio from Pella does not contain any example of this phenomenon. The reading dapina here as Macedonian equivalent of tapina creates, as Professor Voutiras first suggested, a major syntactic difficulty. I explain. Φίλαν ικτήρεται δαίμονες φίλοι. If it's ταπεινά γαρ είμαι ταπεινά, φίλων παντών και ρήμα, this ought to be a ρήμα παντών φίλων. Όχι. Έχω χρησιμοποιήσει την, I have used the Doric accentuation all over this text. So you have here or there the Doric accentuation in this text. So here, dapina or dagina, as it is written, I think that it cannot be da pina, and I don't think that it could be used, this word, in capital letters as an example of this feature. Putting aside the voiced consonants, we can describe Macedonian as follows. According to Herodotus, Macedonian and Doric are consecutive names of the same polyplaniton karta ethnos, polyplanitou karta ethnos. As it is said before, according to Livius, Aetolians and Acarnanians are eustem linguae hominus in a context of 200 BC. The same tradition reflects a fragment of Strabon, which speaks about the linguistic affinities between Macedonian and Hyperotans, which dialect belongs to the same family. So I shall come to the discussion we started before. We have between Macedonia and northwestern dialects the same the same hypheresis, for example, in Thetima, in other examples as Neminios. We have creation of a diphthong in Teucritos 4th century Cleopatra. We have creation of, we have merged Tan, Alan, Pasan, Kiran, Pasan in the other defixio, in Pella and the other defixio also. And we have also the resolution of hiatus, as in Lamedon, Lanika, from Lavo, in local names and in glosses. According to orthographical data, we have an eta which renders ancient A long, epsilon iota which renders the result of assimilation of two short. We have amenandros, which reflects a spelling of epsilon instead of epsilon iota. Macedonia has personal names of the type xen, not xin as in Ionian, for example. We have omega in early inscriptions, for example, in Zobia. Omicron renders the result of the merge of two O, and after the mid-4th century, and later U is used in the interior, first in the interior as in Clovulos, and a little bit later, Omicron Epsilon is used instead of O in genitive. But we have some early examples like Theotelis, Theotelus, as you see here from the end of 5th, beginning of 4th century. All this has to be an evidence that Macedonian belongs to Doris Meteor according to the current classification of Ara. In the word interior, the cluster is simplified in Pasan with A long in both defecciones from Pella and Arethusa. The ending of Pasan proves that this A long is not due to Attic. Let's speak about glosse. The number of Macedonian glosse varies from 100 to 150. Some scholars included everything qualified as Macedonian, some excluded the terms of koine, some included every term with void consonant. Schmidt, for example, who edited Issicius, notes in the commentary of terms like Vikas, Dalankan, Drops, Kanadoi, Macedonicum videtur, Macedonicum enim este, delta pro theta in ader, adalos, danos. That is, even words without an ethnicon are considered as Macedonian. So, most of the terms included in Macedonian glosses come from Hesychius. We have some terms from Suda. They concern especially military terms and weapons, as you see in your examples. We have terms related to the flora and the fauna, terms related to the environment and the weather, names of God, terms related to the food and drink, terms related to the topography, like Aspilos, Chimaros υπό Μακεδόνων, parts of the body, expressions, colors, terms related to political institutions. Some of the glossy present of the northwestern characteristics as Peliganes, Anharmon, and some, like Dorax, Kevali, have a voiced consonant. Personal names. Personal names display systemic and persistent phonological and morphological characteristics of the local dialect. Although affected by contemporary fashions, particularly in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, from a semantic point of view, names rely upon values and historical or cultural factors of the local society they name. The personal names in early inscriptions that mention Macedonians, as I said before, we have here only late archaic classical names till the end of 4th century, and only name of Macedonians, not people from Chalkidiki, for example. From a morphological point of view, Macedonian personal names can be classified into compound names, denoting the values or aspirations of the local society, the historical circumstances, the features of the local environment, while many of them are theophoric. There are also shortened names known as Kurznamen, deriving from compound names, usually by losing one of the two components. And there are also non-compound names, usually referring to some aspect of the bearer's physical appearance. From semantic point of view, as I said, masculine compound names are connected to war and related fields and vastly outnumber all other categories. So, for Macedonians, a name which has a semantic field akin to Niki, war, army, etc., was privileged until the end of the 4th century. Other categories of names are represented, but they are not so, are more rare than the names concerning war. Theophoric names are very widespread throughout Macedonia from the earliest times, and numerous compounds with theos as first element are attested. Particular mention is made of names of deities such as Eirene, Euclia, Heracles, Satyros, and Silanos or Silinos, which are used also as personal names. They are of comparatively early date, they are clear cases, and constitute an interesting fair-sized set of the Greek-speaking world. To a possible objection that these examples are names of minor deities, it must be emphasized that Heracles was the ancestor of the Temenid royal house, Heracles Patroios, as recorded in the votive inscription from the palace of Aegae. Another major category of personal names are the compounds and Kurznamen from mythology and Homeric epics, indicating their extensive dissemination and influence on Macedonian society. Some of the non-compound names refer to physical characteristics or character of the bearer. Obviously, they are mostly nicknames. A fair number of them have to do with local, have to do with local flora and fauna. As you see, we have many personal names which contribute significantly on the vocabulary of ancient Macedonia. As elsewhere in the Greek-speaking world, changes in the local nomenclature gradually occur during the Hellenistic period. Of the traditional names, the ones that survives are certain dynastic names in broad sense, including names of companions of Alexander III. Some personal names, like Demetrios Posidonios, had become widespread throughout Macedonia and elsewhere during the Hellenistic period, and had become exceptionally popular in the Roman area. And via Christianity, Demetrios, for example, remains common in later periods too, particularly in regions bordering Macedonia. Some of the traditional names have adapted wholly or partially to Koine. The continuity of dialectal forms in personal names with a long A, even after the loss of phonemic length, gave local names a standard characteristic. This does not, however, mean that the long vowels were retained in the phonological system of the Koine of the region. The Bereniki type names, in which scholars recognize the Macedonian characteristic noted before, appear more and more rarely in the Hellenistic and Roman periods in the names of all epigraphical population. Till last summer, I was confident that Macedonian had gained a place in ancient Greek dialectology, after at least the work which has been done the last 30 years by many scholars. To my disappointment, one of the two companions to ancient Macedonia, edited by Roisman and Vordington in 2010, reserved than 1/2 a page between the 668 pages. And what do we learn about Macedonian in this book? We learned that inscriptions are published rarely in Macedonia, and Supplementum Epigraphicum Graecum is the place to find the inscriptions. We have, of course, some corpora, they said, but we have just 200 Macedonian names. For heaven's sake, only the material I presented here are doubled in number than the 200 Macedonian names. Conclusions on the matter are usually mitigated, about the language of Macedonia. Greek specialists are always accused for ethnocentrism and partiality. I wonder how science is still practiced nowadays, after all. Thank you for your attention.
So, thanks you a lot of this interesting and wonderful paper. We have time to discuss and to make comments or make questions. No, Emilio.
Just a comment and a question. The comment is that you started your talk by giving the last dialectal testimonium of Macedonian. I would say that it's the last epigraphical testimonium for the moment.
Yes, the last epigraphical is this Defixio of Aratus, which is dated. Oh, excuse me. Which is dated by the excavators in early 3rd century, but I think that is in the last decade of 4th century because of the internal data.
Yeah, the comment is that this is the last epigraphical attestation.
Yes. And the last mention of Macedonian as oral form is the comment about the last Cleopatra, which was speaking Macedonia among other languages, although her fathers neglected even their ancestral language.
And the question would be, I'd like to listen to you about the reasons for edit the cursed tablet of Pella with Doric accentuation.
If it's a Doric, northwestern text, we have, I think, to accentuate accordingly. That's why I used the rules of Doric accentuation in order to present it before this audience, this text.
Yeah, Hazarui.
Yeah, just on your point 7.1 about the personal names, probably you want also to include Menekoros besides Menelaos, or is...
Yes, because it has to do with Menos.
Excuse me?
Because I mentioned Menos as a word referring to the war and... Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, sorry.
Because I consider Menos as a word related to force and...
Yeah. No, but I mean actually in the case of your Menelaos. Yeah?
Yes.
I mean Menekoros with double R could certainly belong here.
Yes.
Or yeah, but you have... No, maybe you assume also that Menekoros, which is not in the list, is also Macedonian, yeah, as I assume.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, because it makes a very nice parallel in this case with Meno, yeah? Meno on Mimno in the sense of make resistance to against someone, And Menelaos, Menekoros.
It's Menos or Meno.
Yeah. But I would say it is better if you say Mimno is stand, waiting for the enemy. And in this case, Menelaos and Menekoros make perfectly sense, also from the point of view.
Prefer that Menekoros and Menelaos.
Yeah, yeah. No, the question is that I just wonder if you have some reasons to assume that this name, in spite of the form Koros, is German hair, the army. Yeah, we're not here. Yeah? Yeah, thank you. And the second question, I must confess, I was not aware that Teretron is given also as Macedonian gloves. This is the Arcadian form. Yeah, so it's curious. Yeah, have you a reason why? It is the term so labeled in two ways.
The problem with glosses in Hesychius is the tradition of the manuscript. So there are many mistakes of this type. I don't know exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but exactly in this case, Teretron could be the outcome of a labiovelar, yeah? And this would be more problems. Yeah? And a last question, information question. In your second line here in this page, have you an interpretation for Tseirini Aphrodite? In other words, how do you interpret the zeta here?
No, I don't have. This is a cultural epithet which refers to Aphrodite.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Kaleris supposed that it's Thracian, but I don't know.
Thracian, wow.
I don't know.
So,
because of Zeta.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure at all.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Ja, Herr Katsopoulos, bitte.
Yes, just a short comment on the last issue of the Blackwell Companion to Macedonia. This is a book prepared, written, and intended for an Anglo-Saxon, mainly American public. That is why there is practically no European
other than
bibliography or
yes.
scholarship except in English. And that's a big problem. America is an isolated country as far as Greek studies are concerned because they can't use other languages besides English. I mean, the students and unfortunately many teachers as well.
Nevertheless, I expected that American scholars or English-speaking scholars would investigate a little bit before giving half a page to Macedonian, because they, from theoretical point of view, they have chapters and chapters on ethnicity of recent and ethnicity feelings and New Macedonian and the Skopje problem and ethnicity in antiquity. But the question of language is just scatteredly mentioned. That's all.
It's because the scholarship is not in English.
Yeah.
Readership. And it's not an excuse. It's a philosophical.
I don't think they avoid this European bibliography because they don't read French or German. They do read French and German and all this. Simply, they wanted to give generalities. And the emphasis and the focus is on other things, as Professor Panayotou said, on ethnicity and these doublets, these coordinate conjunctions there, let me say. And not on language. On language, there is nothing. If they wanted to write a chapter on language, they could have written it. And of course, they would include a bibliography, but their decision was not to have. Well, no, none, but this does not mean that they cannot read it.
Translate
Okay.
something.
That's why I said it's a philosophical decision. In other words, the emphasis, the focus, the direction is somewhere else, not on the language issue.
But you can find everything from architectural and houses and everything except language.
Yeah.
Antiquity, thoroughly.
I
Leaving
agree.
aside.
I agree. I'm not trying to justify
Yes, I
their decision.
understand,
It's the reality. This is how it is.
Other question about Macedonian. Only to add that the Macedones have also a physical shape. The Macedones are the long guys.
Yes, Homer uses this expression for a tree.
Yeah.
And it seems that they were the
Use the microphone.
Oh. They were the Highlanders, the big ones.
Yeah, for sure.
And their name, which is used either as autonymic or heteronymic, is used only Makedonos and Macedon.
Achilleus had Myrmidones, but Philip Macedones.
Genau.
And the last question, if I remember well, what did you with bricks? The koine in Macedonia or what?
Excuse me?
When you worked in Nossi, what was your work about the Macedonian?
At that time, mainly on koine.
Was a koine in Macedonia?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, then we have to close this session, to take a coffee, and to continue in 15 minutes. Thanks a lot.